Can you change your name in Zoom to be Ryan? Oh, done.
It's weird how to add your name, somebody's name.
Perfect. All right. Well, thanks for joining. We might get one more commissioner in here shortly, but this is the first working group or committee meeting for the Building Decarbonization Committee within Eugene Sustainability Commission. And we've got, it's not, the word quorum doesn't apply, but I think a critical mass here of the folks on the Eugene Sustainability Commission who are participating in this committee. So the focus of our meeting today is talking about split incentive challenges. And we've got two invited folks joining us, invited experts joining us, Ryan Sheehy and Faith Graham. I will let you two introduce yourselves in just a moment so that I don't get pieces wrong, but I'm really excited and really thankful to both of you for taking the time to join us. I hope that it's not much of an imposition, and we're not, for the rest of the committee members, it's not a presentation. We haven't asked them to prepare content to present to us. This is a roundtable conversation. And the intent here is, I think we've hopefully as a committee, we all have done enough legwork that we are familiar with the concept of the split incentive. We don't need to be experts in it, but we pretty much know what we're talking about here in terms of what is the thing. But then the next step is, what can we do within the city of Eugene, whether that's the Sustainability Commission or the city at a policy level, or other actionable steps that Ryan and Faith, you might have seen, or you might have thoughts on places we could go to try to resolve that. And some of the really quick context within Eugene, most of our housing is rentals. So there's a significant need for solutions to bridge that gap. We have climate goals. I think we're all aware that we're in a climate crisis. And one of the ways to reduce emissions while improving the structures in which we spend 90+% of our time, these buildings, homes and buildings, is reducing building emissions as one of the most important pieces. So this is the Building Decarbonization Committee. And the split incentive challenge is just a hairy challenge, and it's not any one individual thing, and there's no one silver bullet solution. So we're just interested in talking about kind of best practices that you've seen, policy approaches, programmatic approaches, and then with the intent that when we come out of this, we are a little bit closer to being able to help inform Eugene City Council and help elevate ideas from both Eugene staff, that would be Ian Penn, who's leading this topic for the city of Eugene, and we're really fortunate to have him participating here. Whether that's from staff, committee, commission, or council, or external, to bring those ideas to council. That's kind of the idea. We're an advisory board. Ian, any other stuff or others, any other things you wanna mention before Ryan and Faith introduce themselves?
So I'll just add one thing. One, Faith, good to see you again, and Ryan, glad you can join us today. I think the thing just maybe to add, maybe on top of what Alexi said, is I think initially we were maybe thinking about this through more of the residential lens. And I think what we're learning as we talk to businesses in Eugene is that there's a similar issue with commercial buildings as well. That I think we knew, but I think we're hearing it a lot more as we have these discussions. And it's been interesting as we've talked about things like green leases and other things that we've been hearing back, that where that does work, where it doesn't work. And so I think, as Alexi said, this is really complicated. I don't think we're going to have a solution of this, but I think we're trying to figure out what are some of the policy mechanisms we can explore to think about how we sort of do this in both kind of the commercial and the residential space.
Thank you. That's a good point. And that echoes my learning curve on split incentive challenges as well. So Faith, maybe you could go first and give us a quick intro on your background and such, and then Ryan ditto, and we'll do very brief introductions on our end and off we go.
Excellent, and I'll keep it really brief. Thank you, Alexi, for the invite. I'm excited to have this conversation with you all and see what we can learn together. Ian, great to see you again. Thank you. I'm glad that we're in this space together. And Ryan and I know each other from a former life as well, and not through Elevate. So the same with Alexi. So it's full circle all the time. So my name is Faith Graham. I am with Elevate Energy. I am the Principal Director of West Coast Development. And many of you may have heard or may not have heard of Elevate. It is a nonprofit organization that works nationally, but it's headquartered out of Chicago. It's about a 25-year-old nonprofit that is working to design and implement programs that ensures that everyone has clean and affordable heat, power, and water in their homes and in their communities. And that is really about equity through climate action. So that's where we're focused on the West Coast, and most of Elevate is focused on housing, so residential, but certainly the programs expand beyond that, and my background also expands a bit beyond that. So I appreciate, Ian, in particular, you saying this is definitely a housing issue, the split incentive, but it's not limited to housing. It's certainly true in commercial as well. So sadly, I don't have a silver bullet solution to offer to you all. I've been pondering this, as many people on this call, my entire professional life. So no silver bullet, but lots of things have been tried, and we're leaning in certain ways at Elevate to try to handle the split incentive as well. So happy to offer that and to learn something from you all. Thanks for having me here.
Hi, my name's Ryan Shee. I've run a company called Fleet Development, and yes, we've worked with Faith and Elevate before in the past. And what our company does is we consult with affordable housing owners, so apartment complexes under HUD or USDA rural development subsidies, about how they can utilize solar energy efficiency, things like that, to reduce their operating costs, and really take advantage of the incentives that are out there right now in this period where there is some money to help make the conversion, reduce the overall building usage, and therefore sustain these buildings, not just in the way that in the energy that they're using, but it's really, for us, is a financial thing. The cost of everything goes up, the cost of energy goes up, and the budgets have to go up, which raises rents, and you get this full circle going. So we're really trying to offset future rate increases, energy usage costs, to keep the buildings working and maintained. All of these apartment complexes at the end of the day are their own individual company, and the company has to be solvent to continue as it is. So we step in and do that. And of course, affordable housing has its own unique barriers to utilizing energy efficiency. The split incentive is part of it. The UA, utility allowance process, that's been in place since the late 70s, is another major issue that we deal with. I think many of these concepts relate to straight commercial housing as well. So yeah, like Faith, I don't have a silver bullet, and it seems like every housing project we work on has its own unique solution, but we've been successful, and now's the time to take action if there ever was, for a lot of reasons. And thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
I just want to make a plug for Ryan and for Fleet, and you couldn't have a better representative here of somebody on the ground trying to figure this out on a daily basis. I was in an office in downtown Portland with USDA and Fleet, I don't know, 10, 12 years ago, trying to figure out this split incentive on solar. So yeah, you got the right people.
Likewise.
Fantastic. Thank you. Maybe I could ask Ian if you could give us a little bit of background on where the city is at this point because just a note for Ryan and Faith, and a reminder for me and everyone else, we're an advisory body. The most we can do is recommend things to city council. Often the staff are ahead of us, and Ian is very effective. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case. So maybe you could just give us a little grounding on where Eugene's at now, so that we start from that position. And
Sure.
lots you have if you want to direct conversation, because we're certainly open to that as well.
Sure. Background, and Alexa, you've hit on a lot of this already, but I think one of the things, and this predates my time in this role, is sort of the understanding that 52% of our housing stock is rental, and there have been a lot of work done, I think, both through ETO and also through EWEB, our electric utility locally, to do a lot of efficiency work and conservation work, and that's something that's been actually pretty effective in terms of reducing demand, keeping basically the amount of energy supplied relatively consistent over the years. And a lot of that, as population has grown, has been through conservation measures and other things. But the one area where there have been really sort of diminishing returns and limited uptake has been sort of in sort of, landlord-owned residential properties, for example, and just trying to figure out how to sort of get into sort of that space. And I know EWEB, I'll speak of them just because I've talked to them about this a little bit, is that there's been limited uptake of this. And, because, we have a really tight rental market, we have a really tight housing market, like a lot of places in Oregon. And so there can be limited incentives for how to induce landlords to get into this space because people are clamoring for, housing. And they're, to say nothing of addressing things related to energy burdens and other things that we want to avoid as we're doing this as well. So that's been a big challenge, is just trying to figure out how to get people to the table. I think the other part of this more recently is that certainly on the heels of the ordinance that City Council brought forth and was repealed last year on fossil fuel infrastructure and new construction, as well as sort of the ongoing sort of discussions both at the city level, but also the state level, whether it's building performance standards or other things, is sort of a council interest right now in leaning a little bit more into the incentive sides of things. How do we create incentives, or how do we leverage incentives? And some of that is, trying to focus on that right now. So a little bit of where we are is less maybe on the policy side of things and more on the incentive side of things, and how do we identify and lean into that. So that's more of like maybe the small p political perspective on this. And I think it's also just something that has been sort of wrestled with. The two of you have done this, for a very long time, wrestling with this. The city's been wrestling with this. In Eugene, we have a home energy score program that is a voluntary program. And so that is something run in partnership with the University of Oregon, and they basically do a lot of the audits. They have students who do this work, really focusing on renters and low-income homeowners. And they've had good participation, certainly before COVID. It kind of plummeted after COVID, and they're starting to rebuild that again. But they've similarly had sort of uptake challenges where a renter might have a home energy score done, and maybe in discussion with their landlord or doing something else has tried to figure out, is this something that we can actually do together? Can we do cost sharing? Have explored different mechanisms of that. EWEB has looked at this as well. And I think there's just been challenges with uptake. So I think it's, the city has kind of rolled around in this as well. And I think we're in a similar position where others are, is not that there's a silver bullet. I actually think that's useful to basically come back to council and say, there's not going to be a single solution to solving this problem. Like, home energy score is information. Maybe that helps. Maybe there are incentives. Maybe there are different things we can bring to identify various solutions, various opportunities to pursue further. But I think the city has kind of done the same thing and sort of struggled with this as well. And I think the other thing, sort of on the other side, is I haven't looked as much on the more recent ODO incentives, but I know in talking to ETO that they had very little uptake, from my understanding, of their landlord heat pump program, and they actually sent a lot of money back to ODO because there just wasn't high participation in that program. And so again, it's what are the things that have worked, have not worked, and trying to better understand, are those applicable here, with the understanding that we're not Portland. We don't have a $1 billion spend plan and all that money to spend on something like this. So we're really trying to figure out, like, what exists out there that we can take advantage of, raise awareness of. And that's kind of where we are in our thinking on this, is like, what's out there, how can we take advantage of that, and how can we make people aware and maybe help people with uptake and leveraging some of those resources.
One other thing I think is relevant to mention just really quick is we're not Portland and don't have the billion-dollar spend through the Portland Clean Energy Fund and such, sure. But also, Eugene is served for gas largely by Northwest Natural, so that's within Energy Trust's world. But electric comes from EWEB, which is municipal. And so there are EWEB rebates, and they're often more generous than the ETO rebates. But it also means that, you know, you've got this sort of jurisdictional split in terms of who runs rebate programs. So adds some complication potentially. But then, you know, EWEB is municipal. It's not run by the city, but it is a municipal entity.
Yeah, it's officially customer owned, but yes,
Right.
it is a public, basically a
Public
public
entity.
utility.
Thank you.
I do have a question that you just set up for me, Alexi, around, we're talking about the split incentive. Are we talking about energy efficiency and the split incentive, decarbonization and the split incentive? I mean, they are slightly different when we talk about what the solutions might be. And I will say EWEB has been an incredible advocate, right, for energy efficiency over the years.
For many years, yeah. I view efficiency as the first step and a foundational piece of decarbonization. So I'm thinking of this personally as a building decarbonization effort. But the reasons that people are going to go do the projects may not be entirely about decarbonization. You know, reducing bills is obviously important, reducing energy burden. In some cases, they might be interested in replacing say a furnace with a heat pump in part to get the air conditioning. That's valid too. Summers are getting hotter. And if we've got smoke intrusions, there might be a lot of value in being able to keep the windows closed for several days at the peak of summer. And so I think there may be multiple reasons in the real world that someone's going to pull the trigger on a project. Even if I think it's a building decarbonization project, I'm interested in solutions that allow people to say, I want to do this project that replaces, say, a furnace with a heat pump, or whatever the case may be. And in a lot of those, in my experience, you know, from professional world outside of this commission and committee, weatherization is a pretty important part of that project if you want it to be done, you know, long-term optimally and really effectively reduce cost burden. Often reduces first costs, especially where you can downsize equipment. So I think efficiency is an important part, but it may not be top of mind for people kicking off projects. So I think some solutions that help bridge the split incentive gap, but also make sure that efficiency is included are probably important from my perspective. Go for it, Dennis.
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts that are circling right now is, you know, some of the Eugene difficulties, as Ian's talked about, there isn't significant funding. This is coming up when the city is looking at a revenue shortfall. So it's really going to be, you know, maximizing people's knowledge of incentives that exist at the federal level, for example, and making sure people are aware, particularly landlords, of the options from EWEB and new things in terms of heat pump support that's come out of the Oregon legislature. So I think there's some, you know, education and inform work that's doable. And then circling back to your comments about weatherization, weatherization is beneficial even if there's not a change of heating or cooling.
Sure.
Simply the space will be cooler. The space will stay warmer in cold weather, even if there's no power. So, you know, in terms of the health impacts and the safety impacts, weatherization can have an impact there as well. And so I agree with that notion. That's kind of first steps. if the rental market wasn't so tight, that would be an incentive to landlords to be able to market greener, more efficient houses or rental units. But in the absence of that, where people are going to take what they can find, in the development of additional housing, that can be incentivized by performance building standards and such. But in terms of the existing stock, that's the tough piece to get to. And reading these definitions in the articles that you suggested about split incentive, unless landlords have some, their own moral commitment. I mean, we have a tiny house studio that I rent, and it's very green, but that's because I find that of value, not so much the direct incentive. So actually in mine, I do get the direct incentive because it includes utilities, in terms of, my income. So yeah, I agree. I mean, the positive piece is, I think the steps we can take is, continuing to inform folks of what's available and, advocate for really good building performance standards for whatever is added to the rental housing and overall housing stuff.
Thanks.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Faith. Hi, Ryan. I work at St. Vincent de Paul of Lane County in housing. Before that, I was a consultant doing various things in Faith. I've appreciated Elevate's work for a very long time. You guys do amazing things. And Ryan, I saw you speak at an Oregon housing conference last fall, and I was absolutely taken with your approach to get over this. And I want to make sure that you have time to share that a bit with everyone because it is unique. A couple things. We've at St. Vinny's, my work here, I've been focused on utilizing rebates at our properties. There are some amazing rebates out there right now, and where we've had a success on these are on some of our challenging properties that are older, that have increasing capital needs, that are outstretching available revenues at the properties. And I want to bring that up because that's a challenging situation in split incentives. And want to give big thanks to Odo and utility programs, eWeb and others. We've been able to find properties where we can stack them up and be able to get close to zero for heat pumps in our properties. And so that is amazing. I would very much like to hear more about both your work. But one question is around federal incentives and where you've seen organizations or different kinds of properties have success with those. We've been taking a look at the GRRP program. And even for an organization where we're the largest nonprofit in Lane County, and we do a lot of affordable housing, and even for us, it would be an enormous lift to get that application in and then follow through using those federal dollars. And so curious about where you're hearing folks having success, where you've had success in that and how that's structured. Thank you for being here.
Aaron, thank you. I am a big fan of St. Vinny's and the work that you all do. Thank you so much for that. I'll just respond really quickly because I'm really interested to hear Ryan too share what he shared last year at the housing conference. So just in response to GRRP, yeah, hard, lots of work. We support, particularly in the Midwest, Elevate supports a number of organizations to apply for those funds and then administer those funds. So you have to build that in, and it's possible, but it's not for a small organization. So obviously St. Vinny's is not that, but it does take a lot of administrative support to make that happen. But it's a great use of funds if you do it. You also, I know, have taken advantage of the OHCS ORMET program, the Oregon Multifamily Energy Program. I believe you have, and there's an open enrollment right now, so I would suggest if you want to put any of your properties through, it's a great incentive program, and that can overlay with ETO. It doesn't overlay necessarily with eWeb, but there's not a reason that it can't. It's not the same funds. So, there's an opportunity there, and if you want to talk to Elevate about that, that's great. We just a full disclosure, we work on the naturally occurring affordable housing side of that program, not the regulated properties, but can put you in contact with TRC, who's the program administrator for that, to figure out whether you have properties that could go in that current bucket. And then, of course, we're still waiting to see direction from Odo on how IRA and funds are going to flow. And, what I understood a few months ago was that it's flowing into current programs, and we're expanding the buckets in current programs. And Ian, kind of to your point before, the heat pump program, my understanding of how that's going through Odo is that it's almost fully subscribed. So because they're free, those are really getting out there. And I think there is just significantly more adoption or public awareness about heat pumps now. You see them right in every neighborhood, and so it doesn't feel like a risk, I think, to people in the same way. At least we're seeing that around the country too, and here in Oregon. So that's helpful. I wanted to go back to just say something about this, like energy efficiency. We've been selling that for 30 years, saying that it's a cost-effective measure, right? It's about lowering costs, and then of course for those that are really interested in climate, then that was something to do for that too. It was a green thing to do, but also just was hugely cost. I mean, now we have, because of our climate emergencies and people's awareness of resilience, just grid resilience even, we have these other factors that are really playing into people wanting to make this decision. So I think that's helpful. It doesn't overcome the money issue. It doesn't overcome split incentive, but it is helpful that more people are interested in newer technologies and making their homes tight and understanding the reasons to do that. And the one other thing I wanted to comment on, sorry, and I'm about to give over the floor, is, I mean, you opened up, Ian, with building performance standards. There is a policy that one could put in place that would require buildings to meet some current standard or to go to zero by a certain date or something like that, even existing buildings. And that is a stick that you can impose. Now, clearly we've all had experience of that not going the way we expected it to. But there are lots of cities around the country that are trying that perspective. And that is a policy lever to just make this happen. I will say that I'm really concerned about that to the extent that we're not incenting low-income families, because that it will create more cost to the consumer if we're not deeply incentivizing low-income households. So I'm worried about that, because there is a way that landlords can just pass on the cost, and particularly in tight housing markets, right? The landlords could just pass on that cost. But that's going to harm our low-income families who are going to bear the brunt of that.
Yeah, and I think if we're going to lean into all of this through an equity lens, which the city wants to, that's an important consideration that is, central to this conversation for me.
Ryan, will you share your silver bullet?
Well, I wish I had one. Let me just start with saying that, there's a lot of reasons to do this, and Faith hit on one that I've been selling a lot too, which is resiliency out here in Eastern Oregon. Power goes out all the time. Sometimes it's really cold when that happens. So that is a good selling point, but it really comes down to cost. So no matter what the threat is, the boogeyman that we're all worried about or whatever, it will not happen at scale without figuring out the financial side of things. It just, all the good intentions in the world still have to be paid for. And so that's really kind of the approach we take, is pretty pragmatic, is like, how can we show that it can be paid for, and that the threat of increased costs is reduced or mitigated or even maybe if you're lucky, you are reducing costs right away to get a landlord on board. And, you know, I think that all the landlords I deal with, and I'm in a vertically integrated industry group, so that person is right next door to me. They care about everything, but at the end of the day, the property has to pencil, so we can't escape that. Otherwise, you have a bankrupt property that doesn't house anybody. So with that kind of pragmatic approach in mind, my goal, after a lot of deep thinking and experimentation, some of it didn't work, is how to get rid of the split incentive problem. And the one I'm referencing is that most of our properties on day one, the tenant pays for the electricity because the tenants naturally conserve more energy when they're paying the bill. And that keeps usage and costs down. So the owner has no incentive to install anything that further reduces the energy because any money they spent on that would never be recouped. The opposite version of that, in the other side of the split, is if the property owner does pay the utilities, the tenants have no incentive to reduce their usage. And in fact, they do not actually reduce their usage when they're not paying the bill. It goes up. Sometimes 2% at a senior property, sometimes 15% at family property. As soon as you release the boundary, the incentive for them to stop using energy, the result is easy to see. So how do we deal with that? So the first step really, and this is not rocket science. Aaron, I'm glad that you were spellbound by the presentation, because sometimes I felt like, I was like, well, this is just common sense in some ways. The first thing is to actually just convince the landlord that they're taking over the utilities. That's really what it comes down to. Because once you do that, you open up some new avenues that aren't there before. And one of them is now they have an incentive to reduce energy cost and usage. And two, you can put solar or even energy efficiency projects in that can offset the entire building's usage. So what I mean by that is if the utility bill is all on one account, and this varies by utility, but if it's all in one account, I can put a 100 or 125 kilowatt system on, run it maybe through 1 meter, depending on the utility rules, and it offsets the entire property's bill. In Pacific Core territory, you can meter aggregate, share credits amongst 50 different meters if you want, even if they're not physically connected. You can sign up for community solar, just one person making that decision and holding that account. You can do whatever you need to do to get the largest project on that's possible. If you don't take that first step, then all you're ever really going to convince the owner through incentives to do is put on a 10 kilowatt project that offsets the laundry. That's it. And that's just, 5% of the building's usage. So you need to get them to take over the bills and put the incentive in their court. Now, that's easier said than done. And just as an example, up to the minute before I got onto this meeting, I'm working with the finance lead on a project that we're doing where we have the entire solar project that we need to offset 90% of the building's usage paid for through incentives and tax credits. And I'm still having trouble getting them to take this project on because it's going to raise temporarily in year one, raise the utility cost by about $5,000, and that's enough to swing the project out. So it's really tough. And it's a project by project battle to figure this out. There's risk taken there. And the thing is, even if the landlord is willing to take that risk, the bank lending on it is not. And the investor lending on it is not. And even the agency, I can't tell you how many times I've battled rural development and HUD about taking a risk, raising rents, which don't even affect what the tenant pays, by a little bit to cover this cost so they can offset 30 years of energy usage, and they still can't wrap their heads around that. That's the kind of intrinsic obstacles we're up against. And that's a really like depressing way to start this, but if you can get through those barriers, it really can make a big difference. So what I talked about in our presentation to Oregon Housing was the scale of the savings that can be realized at a property once you do this. And I think it's something a lot of owners don't realize, but I just used a small 20-unit property that had a $20,000 a year power bill, counting all the tenants and the laundry and office and all that stuff. And you know, they could only put a 16 kilowatt system on the laundry meter and save about $1,800 a year. But if they took over the property bills and use the tax credit incentives and the other rebates and programs that are out there, that $19,000 that they were paying to the utility actually now gets directed back to the property, and they can save $12,000 on their budget year over year after that. And that's just, you know, a year one savings. You know, I think we all realize, well, maybe you don't in Eugene as much, but the rest of the state is going through double-digit rate increases on power. Pacific Power just announced a week ago that they're going to lobby for a third 18% rate increase in January of next year. So it's like a matter of survival for the property owner. Those rate increases actually exceed the rent caps that the state has on in a lot of different places. So it puts the landlord in this bind where the costs are going up faster than they're even allowed to raise rent. And, you know, that's a whole different subject, but it really kind of incentivizes them to take a look at the energy costs and how they can tackle it. But there's a lot of rebates out there right now. Just the Inflation Reduction Act, we just got our first 50% credit, which is a crazy solar credit that never existed before. You can stack that with the, like someone was mentioning earlier, stackable rebates on heat pumps and solar to some degree. I mean, it's getting right now in Oregon, you can get 50 to 70% of your project paid for if you're smart about how you put it together. And if you can just bridge the gap on the rest of that, it can really pay off for you, because now you're locking that utility cost in at least at this year's rate, if not reducing it. So every project takes a lot of number two pencil work to figure out how that can happen, but it's certainly a good time to do it. So one of the other barriers we have besides split incentive is just low cost financing. You know, if you, even after the rebates are in, you still typically need a loan, and the loan rates are too high to make work in a lot of cases, because the loan payments are paid for by the savings on the utilities, and you need a reasonable loan rate to do that in a lot of cases. So that's another thing. Some of the things that I might suggest looking at for the city of Eugene is, and this may not be possible to do, but there are a lot of programs through the EPA and the DOE right now where municipals, cities can apply for saving. I know like Oregon's Odo is applying for this enormous EPA grant right now. It's 140 million, I think they're asking for, that they can provide rebates, but I think cities can apply for that too. There's also the REST program from USDA. It's a Rural Energy Savings Program, and that would be money that could be given to a municipal. I'm pretty sure municipal. If not, there's other ways you could probably grab that money. Certainly, probably your utility there in Eugene would be the best source to apply for that. And they can relend that money at 5%, which really helps. They can relend it at 0% if they want, but they can get 10, 20, $40 million from USDA to pay for these upgrades. And it can be recouped through on billing. That's a clever program that's very underused. It's got hundreds of millions of dollars sitting there's some places, some rocks to lift up and look under from the city level to look at, to actually provide resources for landlords to make this jump and feel comfortable about it, that they aren't gonna end up running the property into the ground budget-wise. Because there will be increased usage at these sites, there's just no doubt about it. But one of the things I explained in my talk is that, yes, if your tenants use 5% more energy, that's an extra cost, but if you're saving 30%, does it really matter? Like the balance is still in your favor. And if the best way to protect yourself from increased tenant usage is to have the biggest solar, biggest energy efficiency project on there, so that when they are using more energy, the rate at what they're using it at is not going up because you're offsetting it. If that makes sense, you know, the utility is going to charge you for everything that they're using unless you're just killing that usage with solar and energy efficiency right before it even leaves the building. And then you're getting it for free. So that's part of it too. It's not to go in piecemeal on this, it's to go in all the way. And that reduces your risk. Guess I'll just stop and let other people talk or ask questions, but this is exciting stuff to have a city thinking about how to do this.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's making me think that we've got a landscape where there's a lot out there. Some of these programs like the GRRP or the USDA Rural Energy Program, those are larger things that a bigger entity would have to put something together on. eWeb, St. Vinny's, a nonprofit, etc. Right? Or the city itself. Not a bad idea. That's the kind of thing we can say, hey, city council, have you considered applying to this thing? We want to be collaborating with staff because that's who's going to get handed the job. If city council says, great idea, they're going to say, hey, Ian, what are you doing next week? So you know, we want to be conscious of that. It occurs to me though that some of these are, you know, if we're, like you said, Ryan, there's a lot of number 2 pencil work per project. And there are some larger property owners in Eugene, but there are also lots of small fish out there who own a few, one apartment building or a few duplexes or stuff like that. There's a fair amount of that. Those folks are not going to be putting all these pieces together, right? They're just trying to keep the rooms occupied, and when a washer breaks, you replace it. Have you seen any success in sort of one-stop shop program offerings that might be replicable here, or like structures that help align all those pieces to say, so that a landlord can say, oh, okay, there are resources on this. I see there are a ton of programs. Can someone just handle that? Financing, incentives, rebates, and then they can make a few phone calls and get the thing moving. Have you seen any movement toward that approach that could be feasible?
You know, other than what I'm doing and what Faith's group is doing, I haven't seen someone really set up a defined geographic area, one-stop shop. I think it's a great idea. You would, you'd almost need that to have somebody in Eugene that can sit down with an owner and just work through it all and figure out what's applicable and what's not, to help them, because it is overwhelming. And everyone that's in the housing industry is overworked, understaffed, and they don't really have the capacity to do this stuff or the knowledge. That's what I found. I guess the short answer is I haven't seen someone stand up a program like that yet. It's almost like something Energy Trust would tackle, I think.
It also seems like if we as a city could get a grant from a federal entity, that it would be but maybe it would be doable to get a grant that hires somebody at the city to be the coordinator for these kinds of projects, so
Yeah.
that there's someone whose job it is to know where the incentives are, how it works, which ones are rebates, which ones are tax credits, which ones are cash incentives, what you apply for, when and how and where, and kind of help people get through that. And that might be grant fundable to make that position.
I would agree with that.
Yeah, I'd say the city is exploring this area, and have been having conversations. I think not to get into it, but there are models out there. I think they've been met with, different successes. I think, block power is obviously well known to a lot of people. They've gotten off to a little bit of a bumpy start in some of their places, but it looks like, they're actually getting some traction in Ithaca, where they kind of rolled out a really high profile program a few years ago, and they're doing some work with the commercial sector that looks kind of interesting. So I think cities are trying to get into this space. Actually, Ryan, I had a clarification for you on the $140 million. Is that solar for all? Is that CPRG? What were you?
Solar for all.
Okay. I think the challenge that we're facing for all of these federal programs, so Solar for All, for example, their EPA is giving out 60 awards in total across the country. And so we look at this as a city and say, we're not going to be competitive. We're not going to, I'm not going to spend staff resources on that because we have very little likelihood of actually landing that. So it's one of those, like, yes, there are opportunities, but how do they align with our goals, our bandwidth, and our likelihood of actually landing something? And so that's kind of the thing that we struggle with a little bit. CPRG has been kind of the same experience. They're going to give out 115. And so we've been spending a lot of time talking to DEQ just to understand what they're doing, make sure that our interests are represented in those conversations, and then figuring out as that money flows, how we can then take advantage of it. So yes, I think, trying to figure out how to navigate that space is just, there's so many things, and trying to figure out where you're going to sort of, aim your powder is the challenge that I think we face a little bit right now.
Yeah, I totally agree. I've wasted a lot of time going after DOE incentives too, previously. The Solar for All that Oregon's applying for, Eugene will be able to make good use of that. Of course, it's all gonna be low income. And I would say that if you want to make the most gains, focus on low income apartment complexes. That's definitely where all the pipes are flowing money to. And I think to some degree, standard commercial properties they're gonna be left behind here, but affordable housing's been left behind for a long time, so I'm okay with it. It's time to help them out too, but as far as commercial goes, Oregon's new building code is pretty stringent, and you're hitting a lot of your goals just with the 2018 code. Existing construction's tougher to handle. I don't, other than some sale of the property in a big recapitalization event, I don't know. And I will say that everything that we're doing is tied to a rehab or new construction. There is no real possibility of just landing on a property and saying you should convert in the middle of a 30-year cycle. It just doesn't work. I've spent a lot of years running in the red, working on retrofits that didn't work. So I wouldn't waste time.
I started a company to do that, Ryan. So yeah, totally, it doesn't work. I did want to respond, Alexi, to your question, and I promised for the rest of you it wasn't a setup, but Elevate is doing exactly that kind of navigator service, or the one-stop shop for naturally occurring affordable housing, which is a misnomer, that name, but really we're talking about low-cost apartments for people who have low incomes, right? So they're not regulated, they're not getting subsidy, but they are primarily these smaller complexes or even single family or duplex that are rented out. And we're having, Elevate is doing that all over the country. We're starting a program in Tacoma, Washington. We're working with OHCS on doing that around Oregon as well for that pot of funds. And what we're finding is that it's still not easy, right? It's still really hard to convince people to find the landlords and convince them to do the work, but we are finding it's necessary to have that kind of service because, as Ryan said, no matter who you are in the housing space, you've got too many jobs on your plate. So if there's somebody that can say, let me take this on for you and braid the resources together to make this project pencil, people are gonna take advantage of that, and it's a requirement to be able to deliver a city program. We are bringing lots of different resources to bear. So it's any utility incentives you can get, it's city dollars, it is philanthropic dollars. All of that is needed for a single pot of funds to go into these projects, to make them pencil and to make sure that we're not displacing people by their rents going up significantly and whatnot. So there's requirements around that in the programs that we run, for example, about not increasing rents drastically or according to some formula, which, you know, we already have in Oregon in lots of places, but that is the kind of one-stop shop or navigator program that we are finding to be the most successful and trying to set up in various places.
What is it you're doing in Tacoma? Can you elaborate a little on that?
Yeah, WSU has it's called the SEEP program, and it was out of ERA dollars in 2010. There was a state funding that's now funded by just Department of Commerce in Washington. And we are standing up a pilot to do a one-stop shop navigator program for these quote unquote naturally occurring affordable housing properties. So these smaller multifamily properties that are not subsidized.
And what are these weatherization, efficiency, equipment?
Yeah, we're not announcing it as a decarb, but that's the goal, is to get all the way to, you know, an electrification project. But of course, starting with weatherization, energy efficiency, dealing with resiliency. So, you know, obviously ductless heat pumps are just such a great new tool in our toolbox, right? Because we get both cooling and the ability to not open our windows in the summer if we need to. So lots of health issues, trying to bring in funds that are not just utility funds so that you can do more on the health and safety, which, you know, as Ryan was saying, just so important to do the whole thing when you're there rather than the piecemeal, because you'll never recoup all the costs that way. Does that answer your question, Alexi?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. That's exciting to see it's moving along. Conscious of the time, we're coming up on the hour. Ryan, I know you have a hard stop in 3 minutes, and given that it's a publicly posted meeting, we keep within time. So I wanted to first off thank you both, and give an option for last thoughts and recommendations. You know, we can follow up with you can always follow up with email resources, and happy to talk further, of course. But you know, I appreciate the things you've raised, and I'll stop talking for the last couple minutes, because I think we've heard some really interesting ideas, and I'm curious if you've got any last, you know, parting thoughts.
I have a quick one that is probably my number one barrier with HUD and USDA properties is when we convert to the landlord paying, naturally the rent has to go up. The rent goes up by the amount that the utility bill is, and it's a net zero difference, but it's called rent. And even though the tenant might not be paying a $50 utility bill anymore, they're now paying $50 more in rent. And we've had a lot of problems with that being interpreted incorrectly by USDA and HUD, as well as the state of Oregon, who has, you know, a rent cap or a rent rate increase cap. And it cuts the legs out under what you're trying to do, even though it doesn't affect the tenants, just because people don't really understand the complexities of it. And I'm not talking about all housing. I'm talking about housing where the rent is subsidized, because the amount the tenant pays is calculated based off their income. It doesn't matter whether it's going to utilities or to rent. And I think people are well-meaning, but they really end up messing with the potential good outcomes by saying, well, you can't raise the rent by $100 a month, because they don't understand that it's not the tenant actually paying it. It never was, really. And so that's the level of like knowledge that has to be there when you're discussing incentives and sticks and all these things, because it's very easy to set up an impossible situation. Just as an example, the 50% tax credit through the Inflation Reduction Act for solar. it requires the financial benefits to go to the tenants, or at least a portion of it. That is actually illegal in HUD and USDA housing to pass cash benefits through to tenants because it offsets their income, which increases their rent payment. It's who thought, the 25-year-old staffer that helped write that law did not know that. And so the programs had to have all kinds of white letters and memos written by HUD to find workarounds to actually use this. So it's all well intentioned, but I just make sure you fully understand whenever you're developing something, the possible outcomes that you didn't expect. And I think that's will really help you come up with a solid incentive program if that's the way you go to get stuff done that makes sense to everyone. Sorry, that's my soapbox. I've been preaching that for a long time.
Thank you. Okay,
I don't know, final words. It's been, thank you so much. And I've had a lot of airtime, so I really don't want more, but I'm happy to continue a conversation if you want to have follow-ups by email or otherwise, happy to join.
thank you. Appreciate it. Appreciate both your time and the time of Ian and the rest of us on this committee. The rest of us on this committee, we have another meeting next month. It's just an internal one. So anyone who has notes, please send them to me. I'll combine with my notes and we'll share that back around. And then next month we will try to think about what may have floated to the top here. And with that, I think we're all closed. Ian, anything to close from your end?
I don't think so. I just thank you again, Faith and Brian, for your information and feedback. Always helpful to fill in knowledge gaps and be able to understand it.
Much appreciated.
Thank you
And
very
so-
much. Very interesting. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.